Welcome to Coastal Matters. I'm Charlie Walters. This is a co-production of Nantucket Community Television, Channel 18, and Nantucket Coastal Conservancy, and we appear approximately monthly. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, all 295 towns and all 56 cities have a Conservation Commission, and Nantucket is obviously no exception to that. Today I'm pleased to have Ian Golding on the show. He is a Conservation Commissioner on Nantucket and has been for a number of years. Thank you for coming by.
Thank you for inviting me, Charlie.
The Conservation Commission does what, for those who do not know?
It basically protects all the water resources on the island, which, and by water resources, I mean everything from wetlands to beaches to water under the ocean to ponds, even to groundwater when it is close to a wetland or a marsh.
And there is an open space component to your domain as well, isn't there?
There is, but the open space is more to protect wetland scenic views. So, in other words, if someone theoretically wanted to put a large factory up downtown and that it affected the view over the harbor, then that would come within our purview.
Now, the state, or the Commonwealth, I should say, has its own Wetland Protection Act, but Nantucket also has its own additional bylaws, and you're charged with enforcing all of them.
We are, and the reason why there are two sets of regulations is that the state allows, when it's deemed proper, for towns and cities to have regulations that are adjusted for specific conditions, so they can actually be more strict than state regulations.
Now, this is a governmental organization, not a private one. How does one become part of the Conservation Commission?
You put your name forward to the selectmen, and the selectmen appoint 7 commissioners in total, and the duration is for 3 years.
Are there term limits?
No, although that was a discussion a couple of years ago. But and in fact, we have 2 commissioners who are in their third runaround, so have been commissioners for over 6 years.
Now, my understanding from the homework I did is that the qualifications are really very loose. You don't have to be a citizen of Nantucket to be on it. You don't have to be a particular age. There is a lot of leeway, in other words. But in the case of this commission, they're all Nantucket residents. There are no teenagers on there.
No. I'm not sure what the requirements are, but we have I think we have now 1 resident PhD down from 3, and but everybody seems particularly knowledgeable in their field. I'm probably the only generalist. So.
Well, it's interesting about the qualifications because unlike political offices, some political offices where you have to be a certain age, that doesn't apply here. But with Nantucket having a seasonal population, theoretically anyway, you could be a part-time resident and yet still serve on the commission. If you were a property owner and you were here only 4 or 5 months out of the year, you would certainly have an interest in Conservation Commission issues. And if you were not a citizen of Nantucket, that would not prevent you from going on there. That has not happened, but I just wanted to throw that in there because I think it's an interesting aspect of how the commission is made up.
Well, my guess is certainly if I was a selectman, I would probably lean towards appointing someone who lived here full time and had shown that they were interested, obviously, in protecting the environment. And I think that's what happens in practice. So,
you're in your 2nd term, if I'm not mistaken.
I am.
And how long have you been on Nantucket?
I've been a resident since 1980. I was a summer brat as a kid, and my earliest memory goes back to 1951 when I was 4, and we were living in England at the time, and it took us 5 days to get over from England to my grandmother's house out in Sconset. And we flew from London Airport in a converted B-29 Superfortress called the Boeing Stratocruiser that had bunks and a cocktail bar in the back where my mother was, shall I put it, controlling her fear of flying. And we had engine failure mid-Atlantic and went into Greenland and then ended up flying down to New York, where we would take the train to Woods Hole and the ferry from Woods Hole to Nantucket.
That wasn't the answer I was expecting, but I'm fascinated.
So, yeah.
What got you interested in being on the Conservation Commission? Was there a specific thing or just a general love for the island?
Well, I'd been on an environmental committee for a nonprofit foundation, the Threshold Foundation, for a number of years. And it coincided, we were doing national work, and it coincided with Sarah Oaktai, a former member, asking me if I was interested. And I thought, of course, after I've been doing all this work for other communities, I asked myself, well, why am I not doing it where I live and where I love to be? So it was sort of a no-brainer when it came up.
Now, for those who didn't know Sarah, she was the head of the field station, the UMass field station on the island, and has since moved to Colorado.
Right.
Living at 9,500 feet, or
right, exactly.
quite the opposite of here, where everything is 100 feet or less.
Right, exactly.
Who is the CONCOM answerable to? Were you answerable to the selectmen? Do you report to the selectmen, or how does that work?
No, we're basically answerable to the courts and the DEP in a sense. In other words, we're only answerable to the selectmen in as much as they don't have to reappoint a member if a member asks to be reappointed. But what happens in practice is that if there's a member of the public who doesn't like our ruling, they first go to the Department of Environmental Protection to ask for an opinion, and if the DEP overrules the Conservation Commission, then either the town can take that to law, or the town can say that we need to accept that decision. And in any event, if either the town or the appellant is unhappy with the DEP's decision, then it goes through the court system.
The DEP is, of course, a state organization, not a federal organization. How often does somebody appeal? I mean, 5%, 10%?
You'd have to ask Jeff Carlson, our very able administrator, for the exact percentage, but we have at least several a year are appealed.
But you have hundreds and hundreds of applications in, so percentage-wise,
Right.
This is a tiny number.
It is. But a lot of the applications deal with fairly minor issues. So the appeals tend to be on issues that are more far-reaching. For instance, a good example would be the geotubes out in Sconset, where the SBPF
Sconset Beach Preservation Fund.
right didn't like one of the rulings that the Conservation Commission arrived at, and so appealed it. And in fact, their appeal was successful in that particular juncture.
Well, I would infer that since so few of your decisions are appealed, that the vast majority of people think you guys are doing a great job.
That would be great news, Charlie.
When there is an appeal, is the local organization usually upheld? Is their decision usually upheld?
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
Well, I'll make a further inference then based on that. You mentioned Jeff Carlson, who heads up the Natural Resources Department
Right.
for the town of Nantucket.
Right.
He works for the CONCOM in part, correct?
Yes, he's our administrator, and So anybody who needs to appear before the Conservation Commission first gets in touch with Jeff, and then it goes from there. And so we don't. Not only do we meet every other Wednesday for the applications that are before us, but we also have field inspections the Monday before the Wednesday, and often we'll go out for several hours looking at the properties that are before us to give us a sense of what we're really dealing with.
Well, let's go through the process step by step, and you can make up an application if you want. What is the first thing that happens?
Well, the first thing that happens is Jeff determines whether or not it needs to go before the commission.
Will the applicant deliver an application to Jeff?
Right.
Okay, and
Yeah.
that could be for any number of things.
Right.
For any number of reasons.
Anything from putting a swimming pool to a tennis court to a secondary building, or developing an area that hasn't had any buildings on it before. So.
And if you are within 100 feet of a wetland, that's when your job kicks off, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
In general.
Yes, but it's the closer you get to the wetland, the more we examine the ramifications of the application.
So you could theoretically own a property that you want to build on, but if the building is not going to be within 100 feet of the wetland, you don't get involved. Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Jeff Carlson, and he reports to you before the selectmen, or I mean, ultimately everybody reports to the selectmen, correct?
Well, I have no dealings with the selectmen.
Except when you're appointed.
Except when I'm
reappointed.
appointed. So I'm not sure that report is the word I would use. I mean, we are for legal purposes, we're employees of non-paid employees of the town, and so. But we're an independent body in as much as we're charged with interpreting and defending state and town regulations.
So now, is the natural resource director hired by the selectmen or by the Concom?
Oh, by the selectmen.
By the selectmen, okay.
Yeah.
So Jeff Carlson, in this case, receives an application from someone to do something. He looks at it and tells you what?
Well, he tells the applicant what forms they're going to need to fill out, and advises them to what extent they will need to tailor their application to get a positive decision, I would assume. We don't really discuss that aspect of it, but in practice, we have a number of surveyors that we deal with, all of whom bring a great deal of knowledge and expertise to the process. So we're very lucky, actually, as a body, that we have such a high caliber of professional applicants. We rarely have an individual property owner before us. For all practical purposes, they're represented by one of the professionals on the island, which is a great help because they're all very knowledgeable.
So Jeff Carlson is helping the applicant do the right thing in
Right.
the application. Typically, how long is it between the time Jeff gets an application and the time it gets before the commission?
I don't know.
It would depend on the application, obviously.
On the complexity of the application, right. So, and then you have applications that we've approved with conditions. All applications, when we approve them, we then attach conditions to them. So, a good example is at the moment, in fact, at our last meeting, I believe 50% of the applications were for swimming pools. And swimming pools come with their own sets of problems because often they're on lots where they're really being shoehorned in, And so they come up against the 50-foot, the sort of the buffer zone of 100 feet. You can actually break down into 3 separate zones. So we basically don't allow any construction at all within 25 feet of a wetland, for example. And between the 25 and 50-foot zone, we don't allow any hard structures, but we'll allow porous driveways or something like that if there's no alternative. And then outside of 50 feet, we basically allow hard structures, and we then have to weigh how those structures affect runoff, groundwater, everything that would have a deleterious effect on the wetland. So swimming pools often by their nature come within 2 feet of groundwater, depending on the depth. And so then the applicant has to ask for a waiver because the regulations are that you can't come within 2 feet of groundwater because you don't want to interfere with the natural flow of groundwater. And then there's the issue of the chemicals that are in the swimming pool and what to do with the water in the swimming pool if it's going to be pumped out in the fall. So this is an ongoing challenge, how to deal with it in a way that all parties feel that it's reasonable. So, and as a practical matter, we now ask that no chlorine or any chemicals are used for at least 3 weeks before the pool is being emptied, so that they have a chance to evaporate. And also, if they're placed where there's nowhere to discharge the water outside of the 100-foot buffer zone, that the owners have to actually use a tanker truck to take the water out of the area. So,
Now, where would that end up?
well, that's a good question, because the DPW is starting to have to deal with, I mean, there are a number of water issues that the DPW is dealing with. And but it would end up in a freshwater sewer, one would hope, rather than the alternative.
You don't want to dump it in the harbor.
No.
You certainly don't want to dump it in the harbor.
No.
Now, you mentioned field trips earlier. When you're making a decision on an application that's at a public meeting, will the field trip have taken place before that, after that, or both? I mean, or either one, depending on the application?
Well, it's a judgment call. So we meet in Jeff's office Monday afternoon and discuss the applications that are before us that following Wednesday, and decide whether or not we need to go out and see, for instance, if there are listed plants, or to give a feeling of how it's going to impact the wetland or
A listed plant being an endangered.
Yeah, and or scarce, a rare plant. I mean, it's not only endangered. Or moths, for instance. We had an application that listed a number of moths that are of concern. So I think that's the least, the lowest level of threat, but nonetheless, it's something we have to take into account. So, and or if it becomes clear during the course of the Wednesday meeting that we need to go out and have a look, then normally we would ask for a continuance and then go out and have a look before it comes before us again. So.
And this, of course, can happen at any time of the year. So if it's a nice, bright, sunny day in August, that's wonderful. But if it's a blizzard in February, you've still got to go out and look at things.
Yeah, we all have sweaters and waterproof gear and boots. But none of us have actually ever been blown away while on an inspection. So.
These applications obviously can take different amounts of time. What's a best case scenario for a simple application and a simple decision on the part of the Concom?
Where
couple of weeks maybe, or if one is lucky?
Yes. I
And-
mean, I can't address the bureaucratic end,
Yeah.
and it also depends whether or not state groups get involved. But as when there's no real complication and there's no real interest threatened, and it just happens to be within between 50 and 100 feet of the wetland, so.
And in theory, an application could take months, if not years, depending on what the commission had to do, whether or not there was going to be an appeal, how long the state wanted to deal with that appeal. But those are the exceptions, not the rule. Most things go fairly quickly.
I would say that the majority of applications end up taking between 2 to 6 weeks. So what happens, for instance, if the commission would like to see the driveway placed somewhere else, for instance, for access, or the building moved, if you're talking about new construction, depending on the impact, or even talking about septic systems. So normally you would have on an application, you would have commissioners would ask questions, and then there would be public comment, which is part of the process and is often very helpful. And then the applicant's agent will come back the second time around, having taken into account what everyone has sort of asked and observed. And so that, I would say, is the normal protocol. So it would be a month, I would say, Charlie, after it comes before us.
That's really pretty fast, I think, all
Well,
things considered.
I mean, in part because of Jeff and his staff, and also because of the professionals who come before us. So they know the regulations, I mean, inside out and backwards for the most part, and they have a sense of what the commission is focused on. So.
And the agent could be a lawyer, could be an engineer, could be anybody really.
Yes, and often we'll have an engineer, a lawyer, and a surveyor before us simultaneously. And then if it's a question of, for instance, having soft armoring to try and protect a post-78 house from erosion, then you'll have the specialist who is charged with putting the soft armoring in place.
A house built after 1978 is what
I'm
you're
sorry,
talking about. Yeah.
pre-78, I beg your pardon.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Give me a terrible slip there.
Well, I've been to some of the meetings, and I find them fascinating. And the fact that the public can just walk in and say something or not say something, you just want to observe. I think we're very fortunate that we can do that, I think. It's one of the benefits of being in a small town.
It is, and it's one of the benefits of living in the United States. There's no question that, who was it, Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House back in the 60s, who said all politics is local.
Yes.
And, it's marvelous. We're lucky that we live here.
Have you been to Conservation Commission meetings in other municipalities? I'd love to see what some of those are like.
I haven't, but I have been to a state conference a couple of years ago that's an umbrella conference of all the conservation commissions, and it turns out that Nantucket has pretty much the heaviest schedule and deals with more applications than any other conservation commission in the state.
Really?
Yeah.
Even more than Boston or Worcester or Springfield?
Yep.
Now, does that mean that in Boston people just do whatever they damn well please, or what?
Well, I think when you think of the topography of the island, I mean, we're surrounded by water and we have wetlands. We're riddled with wetlands, and considering the pace of development, I think that's one reason why we have such a heavy docket. So there are commissions that only meet every other month in certain towns and don't even have regular staff, it turns out.
Huh.
And that's certainly one thing that we need more, I think, is enforcement is an issue.
Yes.
And so if any selectman is watching this, I would appeal to them that
They're all watching it, I'm sure.
yeah, right. That they give the Natural Resources Department more money so that they can hire another member to, because we could do with more staff, really.
Well, it's fascinating that we're so much busier than the other places in the
Yeah.
Commonwealth. But how many hours a week do you suppose you put in on average? Unpaid hours, I'll emphasize.
Well, I think our meeting. Well, we don't put in as many hours as the HDC, I don't believe. So,
Does anybody?
right, exactly. So, whenever we're feeling hard done by, we just look over to the HDC. But I think we had our last meeting lasted 4.5 hours, and I probably spend a couple of hours on the paperwork, at least depending on what's before us, and then we have the site visits. So I would say most of us spend about 10 hours a week, 10 hours every 2 weeks, a minimum.
Well,
So
a big
it's not
chunk of
that
time.
onerous, but-
Well, it's a big chunk of time. I mean, that's more than a full day's work.
Right. But
Well, we appreciate that you all do this. And tell us when and where exactly you meet.
we meet in the police station or the public safety building almost every other Wednesday. So probably 24 times a year at 4 o'clock upstairs in the public meeting room.
And anyone can go, and
I encourage anybody to come.
and you don't have to stay for the entire meeting if you don't want to. You're allowed to come in late. You're allowed to
Oh,
leave
yes.
late.
Any member of the public can just
Well, I
walk
don't
in.
mean you personally. Hopefully you're there for the entire meeting.
Right. Although we obviously have to recuse ourselves if we're abutters, as I was in a case not so long ago, in an application not so long ago, or in the case of a couple of the members are landscapers and architects, and so there are cases or applications where one or two members have to recuse themselves.
Are there alternates, or
No,
people just sit out and that's it? It's not like the
Right.
HDC, in other words.
no.
Ian Golding, thank you for coming in and telling us about this commission that everyone knows about, but most people don't know specifics about exactly how they do what they do. So
Well,
I
Charlie-
appreciate it.
Thank you for inviting me, and always a pleasure to see you.
Maybe you can come back sometime.
Thank you.
For Coastal Matters, I'm Charlie Walters. Thank you for tuning in. Please tune in again next time.